The Buddha reveals why there is no such thing as a just war. There's a depressing pattern in human behavior that Mark Twain noted more than a century ago, and it's with us still. The powers that be want a war. Politicians and the media start beating the drum, denouncing the evil intentions of the enemy and calling for all patriotic citizens to attack them. At first, people are reluctant to go along, but then religious leaders jump on the bandwagon, telling their followers that it's their sacred moral duty to support the war machine. Soon, the whole country is aflame with the moral need to fight the enemy. Those few who question this need are branded as traitors, march off to battle, only to find how ghastly war actually is. They realize that they were duped, and that their side is not as virtuous as they had been led to believe. Many of them are killed. Those lucky enough to return home tell their families and neighbors, never again will they be tricked into going to war ever again. But then, after a while, the powers that be want another war. Politicians and the media start beating the drum. If the arguments for the last war no longer work, they find new ways of raising the emotional pitch of their rhetoric, so that soon the whole country is swept up in war fever all over again. The only way to keep yourself from getting sucked into this pattern is to have strong principles against killing, principles you hold to no matter what. This is one of the reasons why the Buddha formulated the precept against killing in the most uncompromising way. Don't intentionally kill anything or anyone, ever. Don't tell other people to kill. And don't condone the act of killing. When asked if there were anything at all whose killing he would approve of, the Buddha answered with just one thing: anger. That's as clear-cut and absolute as you can get. And it's clear-cut for a reason. Clear-cut rules are easy to remember, even when your emotional level is high. And that's precisely when you need them most. If you approach every argument for war with this precept in mind, then no matter what reasons people might cite for supporting the war, you protect yourself by always putting the precept first. If you leave room in your mind for exceptions to the precept, someone will find a way to exploit those exceptions. And you'll be back where you were before you had the precept, fooled into supporting another war. The precepts are like a fence around your property. If there's a gap in the fence, anything that can fit into the gap or enlarge it by wriggling through will be able to get in. It'll be as if there weren't a fence there at all. Now, it's important to remember that the Buddha never forced the precepts on anyone. Instead of calling them obligations, he called them training rules, and the training is something you take on voluntarily. Your moral behavior is a voluntary gift of safety to the world. If you can make that gift universal, with no exceptions, you can have a share in universal safety as well. If you actually break a precept, the safe course of action is not to try to redesign the training to justify what you've done. Instead, you honestly admit that your training has lapsed and do your best to get back on course. Given that the texts are so clear and unequivocal on the issue of killing, it's hard to conceive that anyone would even think of trying to formulate a Buddhist theory of just war. Yet, there have been such attempts in the past, and they're with us again now. If we have any concern for the Dharma at all, it's important to reject these theories outright. Otherwise, we find ourselves quibbling over when and where it's right to issue a Buddhist license to kill. And no matter how strictly we try to restrict the license, it's like running a tank through the back of our fence and putting up a sign next to the resulting hole, saying that only those thieves and bears who promise to behave themselves nicely will be allowed to enter, and then leaving them to police themselves. Because the early texts rule out killing in all circumstances, attempts to formulate a Buddhist just war theory ultimately have to fall back on one basic assertion. There's something wrong with the texts. Because this assertion can take many forms, it's useful to examine a few of them to see how misleading they can be. That way, we won't fall for them. The big one is this: the moral ideals expressed in the early texts may be inspiring, but they offer no practical guidance for dealing with the complexities of real life. Real life presents situations in which holding strictly to the precepts would entail loss. Real life contains conflicting moral claims. The texts recognize none of these issues. They teach us no way of dealing with evil aggressors, aside from passivity and appeasement, hoping that our loving-kindness meditation will inspire in the aggressors a change of heart. So, on this issue, we can't trust that following the texts will protect us. Actually, the early texts are not silent on issues of moral complexity. They do answer questions about the losses that can come from holding to the precepts and about the desire to meet obligations at odds with the precepts. It's just that their answers aren't the ones we might want to hear. Of course, these answers are based on the teaching of karma and its effect on rebirth, teachings that many modern Buddhists view with skepticism. But the Buddha dealt with skeptics in his own day. As he told them, no one can really know the truth of these teachings until awakening. But if you take them on as working hypotheses in the meantime, you're more likely to be careful in your behavior than if you didn't. If it turns out that they're not true, at least you can die with a clear conscience, knowing that you've lived a pure life, free from hostility or ill will. When you discover that they are true, you'll be glad that you kept yourself safe. The Buddha readily acknowledged that there are times when following the precepts will put you at a disadvantage in terms of the world. You might lose your wealth, your health, or even your relatives. But those losses, he says, are minor in the long run. Major loss would be to lose your virtue or to lose right view. Those losses could harm you for many lifetimes to come. Here, the lesson is obvious. For the sake of your long-term benefit, be willing to suffer the lesser losses to keep from suffering the major ones. At the same time, there are many occasions when breaking a precept brings short-term rewards in this world. But from that fact, the Buddha never drew the conclusion that those rewards justified breaking the precept. As for conflicting obligations, the texts tell of the case of a person who, finding that he's about to be thrown into hell for breaking the precepts, pleads with the Hell Wardens for leniency. He broke the precepts because of his social obligations to family, friends, or king. Does he get any leniency? No. The Hell Wardens throw him into hell even as he's making his plea. The Buddha said that if you want to help others, You can provide them with food, clothing, shelter, or medicine as needed. Better yet, you get them to follow the precepts too. By this token, if you tell others that there are times when it's their moral duty to break the precepts, you're actually working for their harm. If they act on your recommendation and are thrown into hell, will you be on hand to plead their case? And will the Hell Wardens give you a hearing? So when the texts tell us to stick with the precepts in all cases, they're actually teaching us how to protect our long-term well-being. This doesn't mean that the precepts leave you totally defenseless against an enemy, just that they force you to think outside the box. If you're determined not to kill under any circumstances, that determination forces you to think in more creative ways to keep an adversary from taking advantage of you. You learn methods of self-defense that fall short of killing. You put more store in diplomacy and don't look down on intelligent compromise. Derkifen, the ideals of the texts are for those who want to go straight to liberation undeterred. They are the ones who should hold to the precepts no matter what, even being willing to die rather than to kill. However, there has to be guidance for those who want to take the longer road to liberation, through many lifetimes, at the same time fulfilling their social obligations, such as the duty to kill in defense of their country. Actually, the early texts do describe a slow route to liberation, and a prime feature of that route is holding to the precepts in all situations. Don't do anything that would land you in the lower realms. By this standard, it's hard to see how an even slower route, one that allowed for theories of just war, would count as a route to liberation at all. As the Buddha pointed out, if you're in battle with the enemy, trying to kill them, your mind is immersed in ill will. If you get killed at that point, your mind state would take you to hell. If you have the wrong view that what you're doing is virtuous, you can go either to hell or to rebirth as an animal. Neither of these destinations lies in the direction of Nibbana. It would be like flying from Las Vegas to San Diego via Yemen, with a long layover in Afghanistan, during which you'd probably forget where you were going to begin with. Isasam. The texts are obsessed with the letter of the precepts, but it's important not to let the letter get in the way of their spirit, which is to cause the least harm for the greatest number of people. Sometimes you have to kill people to prevent them from doing greater harm. This spirit is never expressed in the texts, and for good reason. It assumes that there's a clear way of calculating when doing a lesser evil will prevent a greater evil. But what clear boundary determines what does and doesn't go into the calculus? Can you discount the retaliation that will come from people who want to avenge your lesser evil? Can you discount the people who take you as an example in committing their own ideas of what constitutes a lesser evil? How many generations or lifetimes do you take into account? You can't really control the indirect effects of your action once it's done. You can't tell for sure whether the killing you do will result in more or less killing than what you're trying to prevent. But what is for sure is that you've used your own body or your own speech in giving orders, things over which you do have control, to kill. A principle that's actually closer to the precepts and allows for no misapplication is that you never use other people's misbehavior as justification for your own. No matter what other people do, you stick to the precepts. Maybe the texts are hiding something. Maybe the Buddha didn't intend the precepts to be taken as absolutes. There must have been times when kings came to consult with him on when war might be morally justified. But for some reason, the texts never tell us what he said. This conspiracy theory is probably the most dangerous argument of all. Once it's admitted as valid, you can turn the Dhamma into anything you want. I personally find it hard to believe that after painting the picture of the soldier destined for hell when dying in battle, the Buddha would have privately discussed with King Pasenadi the grounds on which, for reasons of state, he could rightly send people into that situation. The texts tell us that he once told Pasenadi that if you break the precepts, then no matter how large your army, you leave yourself unprotected. If you keep the precepts, then even if you have no army at all, you're well protected from within. Was this teaching meant just for public consumption? Are we to assume that the Buddha was a two-faced Buddha who taught a secret doctrine to kings so completely at odds with what he taught in public? The Buddha had so many chances to make exceptions to the precept against killing, but he always stuck by his principles. No intentional taking of life. Period. When you try to cast doubt on these principles, you're working for the harm of many, leaving them unprotected when they try to determine what should and shouldn't be done. That's much worse than leaving them without a license to kill an aggressor, no matter how bad. Getting the message. The Buddha is famous for having refused to take a position on many of the controversial issues of his day, such as whether the cosmos is finite or infinite, eternal or not. In fact, many people, both in his time and in ours, have assumed that he didn't take a firm position on any issue at all. Based on this assumption, some people have been exasperated with the Buddha, accusing him of being wishy-washy and indecisive, while others have been pleased, praising him for being tolerant and refreshingly free from ideas of right and wrong. Both reactions, however, are misinformed. The early texts report that a group of wanderers, in a discussion with one of the Buddha's lay disciples, once accused the Buddha of not taking a position on any issue, and the disciple replied that they were mistaken. There was one issue on which the Buddha's position was very clear. What kind of behavior is skillful and what kind of behavior is not? When the disciple later reported the conversation to the Buddha approved of what he had said. The distinction between skillful and unskillful behavior lies at the basis of everything the Buddha taught. In making this distinction, the Buddha drew some very sharp lines. What is unskillful? Taken life is unskillful. Taken what is not given. Sexual misconduct, lying, abusive speech, divisive tale-bearing, idle chatter is unskillful. Covetousness, ill will, wrong views are unskillful. These things are called unskillful. And what is skillful? Abstaining from taking life is skillful. Abstaining from taking what is not given, from sexual misconduct, from lying, from abusive speech, from divisive tale-bearing, abstaining from idle chatter is skillful. Lack of covetousness, lack of ill will, right views are skillful. These things are called skillful. Killing is never skillful. Stealing, lying, and everything else in the first list are never skillful. When asked if there was anything whose killing he approved of, the Buddha answered that there was only one thing: anger. In no recorded instance did he approve of killing any living being at all. When one of his monks went to an executioner and told the man to kill his victims compassionately, with one blow, rather than torturing them, the Buddha expelled the monk from the Sangha, on the grounds that even the recommendation to kill compassionately is still a recommendation to kill, something he would never condone. If a monk was physically attacked, the Buddha allowed him to strike back in self-defense, but never with the intention to kill. As he told the monks, "Even if bandits were to carve you up savagely into pieces with a two-handled saw, he among you who let his heart get angered even at that would not be doing my bidding. Even then you should train yourselves. Our minds will be unaffected, and we will say no evil words. We will remain sympathetic, with a mind of goodwill, and with no inner hate. We will keep pervading these people with an awareness imbued with goodwill, and, beginning with them, we will keep pervading the all-encompassing world with an awareness imbued with goodwill, abundant, expansive, immeasurable, free from hostility, free from ill will. That's how you should train yourselves." When formulating lay precepts based on his distinction between skillful and unskillful, the Buddha never made any allowances for ifs, ands, or buts. When you promise yourself to abstain from killing or stealing, the power of the promise lies in its universality. You won't break your promise to yourself under any conditions at all. This is because this sort of unconditional promise is a powerful gift. Take, for instance, the first precept against killing. There is the case where a disciple of the noble ones, abandoning the taking of life, abstains from taking life. In doing so, he gives freedom from danger, freedom from animosity, freedom from oppression to limitless numbers of beings. In giving freedom from danger, freedom from animosity, freedom from oppression to limitless numbers of beings, he gains a share in limitless freedom from danger, freedom from animosity, and freedom from oppression. This is the first gift, the first great gift, original, long-standing, traditional, ancient, unadulterated from the beginning, that is not open to suspicion, will never be open to suspicion, and is unfaulted by knowledgeable contemplatives and Brahmins. If you make exceptions in your promise to yourself, trying to justify killing in cases where you feel endangered or inconvenienced by another being's existence, your gift of freedom is limited, and you lose your share in limitless freedom. Thus, the gift of freedom, to be fully effective, has to be unconditional, with no room for exceptions, no matter how noble they may sound of any kind. The dynamic of this kind of gift, of course, depends on an important principle, the teaching of karma and rebirth. If you act on unskillful motivations, the act will result in your suffering, now or in lives to come. If you act on skillful intentions, the act will result in your pleasure, now or in lives to come. If you don't kill anyone, you are not creating the circumstances where anyone or anything will cut short your lifespan. Your past karma may still leave an opening for your murder or accidental death. You can't go back and undo what you've already done. But once you make and follow through with the promise not to kill again, you are creating no new openings for having your life cut short. As the Dhammapada says, if there's no wound on the hand, that hand can hold poison. Poison won't penetrate. Where there's no wound, there's no evil for those who don't do it. This is why the Buddha listed virtue as one of a person's greatest treasures. Kings and thieves can steal your material belongings and even take your life, but they can't take your virtue. If it's uncompromising, your virtue protects you from any true danger from now until you reach nirvana. Even if you're not ready to accept the teaching on karma and rebirth, the Buddha still recommended an absolute standard of virtue. As he told the Kalamas, if you decide to act skillfully at all times, harming no one, then even if it turned out that there was no life after death, you'd still come out ahead, for you would have been able to live and die with a clear conscience, something that no amount of money or political influence can buy. So the Buddha's position on the precepts was uncompromising and clear. If you want to follow his teachings, there's absolutely no room for killing, stealing, or lying, period. However, in our current climate of terrorism and counter-terrorism, where governments have claimed that it's their moral duty to lie, kill, and torture in order to prevent others from lying, killing, and torturing, a number of Buddhist teachers have joined in the effort, trying to find evidence that there were some occasions at least where the Buddha would condone killing or offer a rationale for a just war. Exactly why they would want to do this is up to them to say, but there's a need to examine their arguments in order to set the record straight. The Buddha never taught a theory of just war. No decision to wage war can legitimately be traced to his teachings. No war veteran has ever had to agonize over memories of the people he killed because the Buddha said that war was okay. These facts are among the glories of the Buddhist tradition, and it's important for the human race that they not be muddied in an effort to recast the Buddha in our own less than glorious image. Because the Pali Canon is such an unpromising place to look for the justification of killing, most of the arguments for a Buddhist theory of just war look elsewhere for their evidence, citing the words and behavior of people they take as surrogates for the Buddha. These arguments are obviously on shaky ground and can be easily dismissed even by people who know nothing of the canon. For example, it has been argued that because Asian governments claiming to be Buddhist have engaged in war and torture, the Buddha's teachings must condone such behavior. However, we've had enough exposure to people claiming to be Christian, whose behavior is very unchristian, to realize that the same thing can probably happen in the Buddhist world as well. To take killers and torturers as your guide to the Buddha's teaching is hardly a sign of good judgment. On a somewhat higher note, one writer has noted that his meditation teacher has told soldiers and policemen that if their duty is to kill, they must perform their duty, albeit compassionately and with mindfulness. The writer then goes on to argue that because his teacher is the direct recipient of an oral tradition dating back to the Buddha, we must take this as evidence that the Buddha would give similar advice as well. This statement, of course, tells us more about the writer's faith in his teacher than about the Buddha. And when we reflect that the Buddha expelled from the Sangha a monk who gave advice of this sort to an executioner, it casts serious doubts on his argument. There are, however, writers who try to find evidence in the Pali Canon for a Buddhist theory of just war, not in what the Buddha said, but in what he didn't. The arguments go like this. When talking with kings, the Buddha never told them not to engage in war or capital punishment. This was his tacit admission that the king had a justifiable duty to engage in these activities, and the kings would have understood his silence as such. Because these arguments cite the Pali Canon and claim a historian's knowledge of how silence was interpreted in the Buddha's day, they seem to carry more authority than the others. But when we actually look at the Pali record of the Buddha's conversations with kings, we find that the arguments are bogus. The Buddha was able to communicate the message to kings that they shouldn't kill, but because kings in general were not the most promising students of the Dhamma, he had to bring them to this message in an indirect way. It's true that in the Pali Canon, silence is sometimes interpreted as acquiescence, but this principle holds only in response to a request. If someone invited the Buddha to his house for a meal and the Buddha remained silent, that was a sign of consent. However, there were many instances in which the Buddha's silence was a sign, not of acquiescence, but of tact. A professional soldier once went to the Buddha and said that his teachers had taught the existence of a heaven awaiting soldiers who die in battle. What did the Buddha have to say about that? At first, the Buddha declined to answer, but when the soldier showed the sincerity of his question by pressing him 3 times for a response, he finally replied, "When a warrior strives and exerts himself in battle, his mind is already seized, debased, and misdirected by the thought, 'May these beings be struck down or slaughtered or annihilated or destroyed. May they not exist.' If others then strike him down and slay him while he is thus striving and exerting himself in battle, then with the breakup of the body, after death, he is reborn in the hell called the realm of those slain in battle. But if he holds such a view as this, when a warrior strives and exerts himself in battle, if others then strike him down and slay him while he is striving and exerting himself in battle, then with the breakup of the body after death, he is reborn in the company of devas slain in battle. That is his wrong view. Now there are 2 destinations for a person with wrong view, I tell you. Either hell or the animal womb." The soldier then broke down and cried, not because he felt that the Buddha's words were cruel, but because he believed their truth and was upset at his earlier teachers for having lied to him. In this case, the Buddha's reticence and tact helped to make his teaching effective. A similar set of events happened when an actor asked the Buddha if there is a special heaven reserved for actors. The Buddha's reticence and tact in informing the actor of a hell for actors who incite their audiences to greed, anger, and delusion inspired the actor to respond in the same way as the soldier. If the pride of soldiers and actors required special handling, even more care was required in the handling of kings, for their pride was often coupled with an unrestrained sense of power. A remarkable feature of the Pali Canon is that even though the Buddha was a member of the noble warrior caste, the discourses generally show a low regard for the spiritual standing of kings. In many passages, kings are mentioned in the same breath with thieves. They confiscate property and show little regard for the rule of law. The canon does recognize exceptions. King Bimbisara of Magadha achieves stream entry the first time he hears the Dhamma, and he never engages in war. But for the most part, kings are depicted as spiritually stunted. King Ajatasattu, on first seeing the Buddha sitting surrounded by monks, can't tell which person in the assembly is the Buddha, a sign of his spiritual blindness. This blindness is later proven by his asking the Buddha's advice on how to defeat his innocent neighbors in war. As one of the discourses suggests, this sort of blindness is an occupational hazard for rulers, in that the unfair exercise of power can make a person unfit for learning the truth. Because of having wrongly inflicted suffering on another person through beating or imprisonment or confiscation or placing blame or banishment, with the thought, "I have power. I want power." When told what is factual, he denies it and doesn't acknowledge it. When told what is unfactual, he doesn't make an ardent effort to untangle it, to see, this is unfactual. This is baseless. Even King Pasenadi of Kosala, the king most closely associated with the Buddha, comes across as well-meaning but somewhat dense. An entire discourse, MN90, is a satire of how his royal position has thwarted his ability to learn the Dhamma. He can't phrase his questions properly, has trouble following a discussion for more than a few sentences, and is unable to come to any certain conclusions about the truth. Still, in other discourses, he has his occasional moments of spiritual clarity, and the Buddha uses those moments as opportunities to teach the Dhamma. The Buddha's approach here is twofold: to try to expand the king's perspective on life at times when the king is willing to be frank, and to encourage the king when the latter gains insights on his own. For example, there's the famous discourse where Pasenadi comes to visit the Buddha in the middle of the day. The Buddha asks him what he's been doing, and the king replies, in a moment of rare and wonderful frankness, that he's been involved in the sort of activities typical of a king intoxicated with his power. The Buddha takes this moment of frankness as an opportunity to teach the Dhamma. Suppose he says that 4 mountains were rolling in inexorably from the 4 directions, crushing all life in their path. Given that the human birth is so rare and hard to achieve, what should be done? The king's reply: what else should be done but living in line with the Dhamma? The Buddha then draws the lesson: aging and death are rolling in inexorably. Given that the human birth is so rare and hard to achieve, what should be done? The king draws the obvious conclusion that, again, the only thing to be done is to live in line with the Dhamma. He then goes on to make the observation that when aging and death are rolling in inexorably, there is no role for armies, wars, clever advisors, or great wealth to prevent their rolling in. The only thing to do is to live in line with the Dhamma. In another discourse, Pasenadi comes to the Buddha and reports his own independent observation. Those who engage in bodily misconduct, verbal misconduct, and mental misconduct leave themselves unprotected. Even though a squadron of elephant troops might protect them, a squadron of cavalry troops, a squadron of chariot troops, a squadron of infantry troops might protect them, still they leave themselves unprotected. Why is that? Because that's an external protection, not an internal one. Therefore, they leave themselves unprotected. But those who engage in good bodily, conduct, good verbal conduct, and good mental conduct have themselves protected. Even though neither a squadron of elephant troops, a squadron of cavalry troops, a squadron of chariot troops, nor a squadron of infantry troops might protect them, still they have themselves protected. Why is that? Because that's an internal protection, not an external one. Therefore, they have themselves protected. It's highly unlikely that Pasenadi would have come to this conclusion if he hadn't spent time in conversation with the Buddha. From that conversation, he would have learned the meaning of good bodily, verbal, and mental conduct, the 10 forms of skillful action. As a tactful teacher, the Buddha simply concurred with the king's insight. The discourses suggest that this strategy encouraged the king to spend time in reflection of this sort. For in other discourses, the king reports many similar insights for the Buddha to confirm. We learn that the king did not always follow through with his insights, but that's not because the Buddha encouraged him to view killing as his duty. In fact, there is one striking example where these insights had at least a partial effect. Ajatasattu once attacked Pasenadi's kingdom, and Pasenadi responded by raising an army to fight him off. After an initial setback, Pasenadi was able to capture Ajatasattu. He could have killed him in revenge, for that was allowable under the rules of engagement during his time. But he chose not to. And it's hard not to see the Buddha's impact on this decision. When told of the battle, the Buddha said, "A man may plunder as long as it serves his ends, but when others are plundered, he who has plundered gets plundered in turn. A fool thinks, 'Now's my chance,' as long as his evil has yet to ripen. But when it ripens, the fool falls into pain. Killing, you gain your killer. Conquering, you gain one. Who will conquer you? Insulting, insult. Harassing, harassment. And so through the cycle of action, he who has plundered gets plundered in turn." Benighted as he was, Pasenadi still got the message. The question is, why can't we?